Chapter 13 of Mag and Margaret, a Story for Girls, by Pansy. Recording is in the public domain. White Dresses. The picnic party, those of them who went from Mrs. Perkins's house, had just been directed to be ready to start, in 15 minutes at the outside, when Harry Porter came hurrying across the meadow and bounded up the piazza stairs 2 steps at a time to speak to Margaret Lancaster and her cousin Fred Ainsworth. "Neelie Saunders isn't well enough to go," he said, making pauses between his words to catch his breath. "That leaves a vacant seat, and I rushed over as fast as I could gallop to see what you would all think of letting that little girl who lives here go in her place." "What little girl?" came quickly from the lips of Margaret. Other members of the picnic party, meantime, came hurrying up to hear any news that might have been brought. "Why, Mag something or other. I don't know that I ever heard the rest of her name. The little girl who lives with Mrs. Perkins. She is a nice, trim little thing, and of course she would like to go. She came from a city where they don't have rivers and groves and things." "The idea!" said Margaret. "Of course it is an idea," said her cousin Frederick, "and a very good one." "I don't see any objection to it," said Anna Woodruff. "She is small enough, certainly; she won't take up much room; and she is a quiet little mouse and won't annoy anybody. I'm awfully sorry for poor Neelie; she was so determined to be well enough to go." "I think it is a perfectly absurd idea," said Margaret. "She never goes out with us girls, nor with any other girls for that matter." "All the more reason why she should have a chance to go to this picnic," said Frederick, coolly. Margaret ignored his interruption. "She is just Mrs. Perkins's servant, and hasn't the least idea of belonging to our society. To let her go would just be putting ridiculous notions into her mind, and Mrs. Perkins wouldn't thank us to do that." "Margaret, don't be absurd," said her cousin, impatiently. "What particular notions could a little girl get by going with a company of other girls and boys to a picnic? I say, have her go, by all means, if Mrs. Perkins will spare her. Who will go and interview the lady?" "I most certainly shall not," said Margaret, drawing her fresh white lawn away from her cousin's side as though contact with him in his present mood might spoil it. "I should expect her to think that I had suddenly become idiotic. She needs her servants, of course, when her house is full of boarders. Mag is in the garden this minute picking berries, and looking like a scarecrow. She hasn't a thing to wear to a picnic, and she would have no one to be around with if she went. Besides being a silly idea, it is a real unkind one. Mag is happy enough where she is, but she would be miserable in our company." "What a mean set we must be!" said Frederick; and while Harry Porter laughed at his significant tone, Anna Woodruff, who was generally an echo of somebody, decided that this time she ought to try to echo Margaret. "I suppose it would be hard for Mrs. Perkins to spare her," she said timidly. "I shouldn't like to ask her. Mag is real industrious, and does a great deal every day. Besides, as Margaret says, she probably couldn't go, anyway, because she hasn't the proper things to wear." "Girls always make such a time about things to wear," said Harry Porter. "Excuse me," said a clear voice just over their heads. "You talked so loud that I could not help overhearing. I will ask Mrs. Perkins, if you would like to have me. I think it would be very kind in you to give little Mag an outing of this sort." "Oh, Miss Ordway!" said Frederick, wheeling around and stepping towards her window. "You are just the one. Mrs. Perkins always does things for you. Do you suppose she could be got away in about 10 minutes? Because we ought to be off. The others will be waiting for us at the turn." He meant, get Mag ready, not Mrs. Perkins, but was so eager that he paid little attention to his pronouns. "I guess they will have to wait one while," murmured Margaret. "The girl has been crawling through the wet bushes and tramping over the plowed ground until she is a sight to behold. I don't believe the Lyman girls would go if they knew of the addition to our company. They are not used to associating with servants." Her cousin turned upon her almost fiercely. His patience was utterly exhausted. "Margaret, I wish you would not be such a hopeless idiot. Who do you suppose cares what a little girl does to earn her living? She has no one to do it for her as you and I have. I am sure it is much more sensible in her to earn it in some way than it would be to fold her hands and let strangers take care of her." "I did not say it wasn't," Margaret answered sullenly. "All I say is that I do not think it is necessary to associate with her. She does not belong to our set." "Fiddlesticks! You have heard some silly girl from a set that hasn't an ounce of brains among them go on in that way, or you wouldn't do it. You needn't associate with Mag, as you call it. Go off in a corner and flock by yourself if you want to. I'll answer for it that Mag doesn't trouble anybody else. They all have too much sense." He was not gentlemanly, I will admit; but Margaret and her airs, as he called them, had been a great trial to him that summer. Her aunt sighed over the fact that Margaret's summer friends that she had met at Hotel Revere had been an injury to her, and her cousin Frederick was sure of it. He had declared, some days before, that Margaret needed severe measures of some sort to bring her back to common sense. Perhaps it was in that way that he excused himself for his manifest rudeness. Meantime, Miss Ordway was busy. Mrs. Perkins had stared at the proposition to have Mag go to the picnic. She had even said, "The idea!" in much the same tone that Margaret Lancaster had used when she said it. She had also told her daughter Annie that Miss Ordway and Fred Ainsworth between them would ruin that child. Nevertheless, she had admitted to Miss Ordway that she could spare her better on that day than any other, and that she supposed it would do no harm to give her a day in the woods, though goodness knew she didn't have much to do any day but race around the garden, or sit on the back steps in the shade and enjoy herself. Mrs. Perkins, hard-worked woman of many cares that she was, honestly thought that the most Mag had to do was to shell a few peas, and pick a few berries, and enjoy herself. But Mrs. Perkins approved of doing, as often as she could, what Miss Ordway and Fred Ainsworth wanted done. "The child hasn't anything fit to wear," she said anxiously. "Her blue calico is in the wash, and her other dress needs mending. I don't calculate to keep her dressed ready for picnics. And she isn't worth sixpence to do her own mending. I never saw a girl of her age who had so little sense with a needle." Poor Mag! Nobody had ever sat down beside her for a single half hour of her life, and patiently tried to show her how to use her needle. The moment Miss Ordway heard this, she thought of another thing she could do for Mag, and wondered that it had not occurred to her before. "I'll see to the dress," she said promptly. "I have been amusing my leisure half hours for some time in fixing over an old dress of mine for Mag. I finished it only yesterday, and it will be the very thing for the picnic." Behold, the dress was white! Not very fine, not very new. Miss Ordway, well as she knew Mag by this time, was not prepared for the ecstatic delight of the little girl. Even the wonder of actually going to a picnic in a great hay wagon with the others seemed lost in the pleasure of the new dress. "Why, Mag," said Miss Ordway, smiling, as she saw the small brown fingers tremble while she handled it, "I did not know you were so fond of dress. You must not let it spoil you, as Mrs. Perkins, I am afraid, thinks it will." Mag looked at her with great, wondering eyes. "How could it, ma'am?" she said simply. "I am afraid I shall spoil it. The dirt gets on things so; though I try ever so hard not to have it. Is that what you meant?" "No," said Mrs. Ordway, laughing. "I meant just as I said, that the dress might spoil you. And you don't even understand what such an idea means." Then, in response to the wistful look in Mag's eyes, which said as plainly as words could have done, "There are so many things that I don't understand. If people would only explain instead of laughing at me," "Mag, some people like dresses and ribbons and things of that sort so much that they make more of them than they should. think about them too much, I mean, and grow vain because they have prettier things than others, or jealous because they haven't them. Do you understand?" "Yes'm," said Mag, gravely. "Perhaps I might get that way about dresses, if there were not so many other things; because I am most afraid I shall get so about going to school." Mag's voice had suddenly grown low and sad, but her eyes brightened again as they fell on the dress, and she said eagerly: "But I am glad, glad that I have a white dress. Oh, Miss Ordway, you can not think how glad I am." "Do you like white so much?" asked Miss Ordway, gently. "Yes'm, I do; but it isn't that. I read about them only 2 or 3 days ago, and I couldn't help wishing then that I had just one white dress to help me remember them, and I prayed about it." Mag's voice dropped again to almost a whisper, and her face took on a look of reverent awe. "Doesn't it almost seem wicked, Miss Ordway, to talk to God about a white dress? But it says so in the Bible, you know. I mean it says to ask for anything you want, and Mr. Frederick said it couldn't be wrong to ask, if you were willing to have God do just as he thought best about it. And so I prayed for a white dress, and I didn't see how he could get me one, and here it is." Words will not describe the delight in Mag's voice. Miss Ordway fastened the wonderful dress in silence. She really did not know what to say to this queer little girl. "What do you mean," she asked at last, "when you say you read about them in the Bible? You did not find anything in the Bible about dresses, did you?" "Oh, yes, ma'am, yes, indeed. Don't you remember? It is all on one of the cards you gave me. Miss Annie Perkins said it was a description of heaven. The man who is telling about it said that he saw a great many people, oh, ever so many, no one could count them, and all of them were dressed in white. And somebody asked him who they all were, and he couldn't tell. Then the angel, I think it was an angel, Miss Ordway, it was somebody in heaven, told him that they were people who had washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. I couldn't think what that meant, and one night I asked Mr. Frederick, and he told me it was people who made up their minds to belong to Jesus, and love him and obey him. Then I knew that I was one of them, and ever since that I have wanted a white dress." Was ever stranger talk than this while getting ready for a picnic? Once more Miss Ordway did not in the least know what to say. She had to smile a little over the thought that Fred Ainsworth had to be called upon to explain Bible verses to this queer little girl. Privately she did not believe that he knew any more about the Bible than she did. "You are an odd little girl," was all she had for Mag's ears. And that small person heard something of the kind so often that it made her very anxious to know what people meant. However, there was time for no more talk. The picnic people were shouting loudly that it was quite time they were off, and Margaret Lancaster was heard declaring that they would better postpone the picnic until the next day, and give all the servants a chance to get ready. Her cousin shot an indignant glance at her, which changed to a triumphant one as Mag came to the piazza. Her white dress fitted to a charm. She wore a pink sash, and pink ribbons tied back her hair, and the neat brown hat matched the entire suit perfectly. Certainly Mag Jessup would not disgrace them with her dress. Even Margaret gave her a swift, almost admiring glance. The little girl in white and pink looked so very different from the barefooted girl in dingy blue that she had seen in the berry patch that morning. It was then that Mrs. Perkins, looking out at Mag, told her daughter Annie that Miss Ordway and Fred Ainsworth between them would spoil that child. Kate Perkins had not been with the group on the piazza, and it chanced that her first knowledge that Mag was to be of the party came when they were getting into the hay wagon. "Why, Mag Jessup!" she exclaimed pleasantly, as she turned back for a second look. "If it made as much difference in me to dress me up as it does in you, I should stay dressed up all the time. So you are really going to the picnic. I'm glad of it. I told mother last night that I wished there was some way for you to go. How did it happen?" "I don't half know," said Mag gleefully. "Such lovely things are happening to me all the time that I don't half know myself. Where shall I sit, Mr. Frederick?" "Plump down anywhere," said Frederick, cordially. "Perhaps Kate can make room for you on her seat, and for me on the other side." It was the first time in his life that he had paid the slightest attention to Kate Perkins. Truth to tell, heretofore he had thought her really not worth his notice; but, since she could speak so cordially to the little girl who someway seemed to be especially his charge on this day, and had frankly owned that she had thought about her and wished that she could go, Mr. Fred decided that there was more to Kate Perkins than there was to half a dozen Margaret Lancasters, if the latter was his cousin. So Kate Perkins with a radiant face made room for Fred Ainsworth, who was decidedly the favorite boy of the party, to take a seat between her and little Mag, and the picnic goers were off. Chapter 14